Would you believe I never intended to write this book? In 2016, when my husband was fired from the church that we had been at for 14 years, I was just in shock. And all I was trying to do was just to survive, to get through what needed to be done for me, for my kids, for my husband. And then in 2017, when a new normal began to settle, and I realized that I could think beyond the immediate, I realized I wanted to do something to help. I knew that my life would never be the same, and my husband and I still didn't exactly know what we were going to do at that time. But I also knew that what I knew as a historian and as a pastor's wife had to be shared. So I began to slowly speak out, writing on the anxious bench. I began with just a couple of posts talking about Paul, and then I wrote a post about Paige Patterson that got a lot of attention. And I received letters from women all over, really the world, reaching out to me and saying thank you. That really helped me. And so I began to realize that by publicly writing about my experiences, I could help. And maybe I could also help the church understand what they had done to women. So in 2019, when I received the opportunity to submit a book proposal to Brazos Press, I decided to do it. I had no idea what was going to happen, but I thought it was worth a try. So why did I make that decision to write this book? I decided to write it because I thought I could help. I realized that as a medieval historian who had been a pastor's wife in conservative evangelical churches for almost 25 years, that I had a different perspective on not only women in the Bible, but also women in church history. And I also understood what it was to be a woman in conservative spaces, to be a woman in a leadership role in conservative spaces. So I realized I had a unique perspective as well as unique qualifications. And I thought, I can give it a try. Because not only might I help women, but I also might help the mission of the church. Just think about it. What if women could preach, teach, and lead however God calls them, just like men? What if instead of churches spending so much time on defining what women can and can't do, as well as making sure that women don't overstep their authority, what if churches instead focused on equipping all the saints to do the work to which God has called us? What if instead of telling God who we can be and who should be used in which roles, what if we let God tell us where we are needed and how we should serve? So I decided to write what I knew as a medieval historian who had been teaching in the classroom students about women in church history since 1998, when I was a graduate student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But I also had to make another decision. And that decision has become one of the more controversial aspects of the book, as well as the reason why I think the book became a bestseller. And that's because I decided to use my personal experience. So why did I do that? Well, for one reason, it was because I really didn't think that The Making of Biblical Womanhood should have been a necessary book. I mean, seriously, so much biblical scholarship exists that undermines complementarian teachings. Also, there is the plain reading of Scripture itself. I like how William Witt describes it in his Icons of Christ, a biblical and systematic theology for women's ordination. On page 168, he writes this: one of the problems with reading 1 Timothy 2:12 as a timeless prohibition of women teaching men is that it seems to stand in blatant contradiction to the New Testament account of Priscilla, wife of Aquila, who was mentioned along with her husband as having taught Apollos in Acts 18, 1-3 and 24-26. The passage indicates that both she and her husband taught Apollos, and since her name is mentioned first, she was presumably the primary instructor. If the prohibition of women teaching in 1 Timothy 2:12 is a universal prohibition, then it presumably would have prohibited the teaching of Priscilla as well. That is what William Witt writes. Isn't it interesting how folk who champion the clarity of Scripture object to the clarity of Scripture in describing Priscilla as teaching men? I realized that even though so much biblical scholarship was out there, ordinary Christians in the evangelical church weren't reading it. The problem is that too many Christians have been taught by their churches to ignore the leadership of biblical women and focus instead on their subordination. They have been taught that because male headship is God's plan, it is the best path for women, or as John Piper writes, for women's maximum flourishing. They also have been taught that those who deviate from the pattern of male headship and female subordination are playing dangerously with Scripture, capitulating to modern culture rather than conforming to the image of God. Just this morning, I was actually reading a book that I have right here in front of me on my iPad about the women in the Old Testament from a perspective that white evangelicals simply don't see. Y'all, I wish I had read the Womanist Midrash before I wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood, because Gaffney's interpretation of Genesis 3 is incredible. Listen to what she says. She says, take for example, this is one of the things that she says. She says, there are hundreds of unnamed women in the Old Testament. Then there are the largely unacknowledged women who make up the peoples of Israel and the nations with whom they are in contact. The number of women and girls submerged under the storylines of the text are beyond counting, not to mention the 111 named women in the Old Testament. So Will Gaffney decided to write about these women from her perspective as a womanist biblical scholar. After Adam and Eve have sinned and God turns to them, Gaffney writes that God reconfigures creation. However, she says, this reconfiguration is not cursing. The offspring of women and snakes will no longer engage in conversation. They will be enemies. Many and great will be the woman's work, not pain, Gaffney writes. Childbearing will be difficult, hard work. There will be pain, and there will be desire. Listen to this. And her man will rule with her. The preposition, Gaffney writes, means in and or with. If one uses one of the standing lexical tools, one will have to go quite a ways into the entry on the preposition to find occasions when it is translated over. In and with are its primary meanings. The verse is intelligible with the simple, straightforward primary meaning, he shall rule with you, end quote. Do I have your attention? Just think how different the lives of women in the evangelical church would be if we even were allowed to consider the fact that instead of the curse in the garden being that men will rule over women, instead the verse was, he will rule with you. This isn't something I ever heard in my church. I bet you didn't either. We have been taught that because male headship is God's plan, it is the best plan for women, as I just said. I realized that I had to get the attention of the evangelical church that had never heard a different perspective on women. So how could I do that? Through testimony. Y'all, evangelicals speak through testimony. It's one of the very first things I learned to do as a child in Wednesday night Bible study, to give my testimony so that others could know Jesus too. I remember the moment I made the decision to include my testimony, my personal story in the making of biblical womanhood. I was sitting out behind my house watching my daughter ride her bike round and round and round. And I realized that I wanted her to have a better Christian world. And so I wanted to speak to my evangelical friends and family members in a language that they could understand. So I decided to tell my story with the evidence from church history.